Many true crime cases fade out of our memory, no matter how horrific or disturbing they might be. But sometimes the details of a case are preserved in a piece of media. Shirley Turner's crimes and the first name of the son she murdered became immortalized in the true crime film Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. Throughout her whole life, Shirley became incredibly good at playing the victim. In her eyes, nothing was ever her fault. There was always someone else to blame. And when Shirley blamed somebody, she was violent, obsessive, and abusive. She had 3 children by different fathers and a string of failed relationships and marriages. One of her former roommates, who had lived with Shirley and her kids, was so concerned about how the children were treated that he reported her to a psychiatrist and then promptly moved out. When social services were notified by the psychiatrist, they discovered that Shirley would regularly hit her kids with belts and then left them home alone for days at a time. Worst of all, she didn't even see anything wrong with what she was doing. Despite the evidence of abuse, the case was dropped, and Shirley's children remained in her custody until she decided that she wanted to attend medical school and then dumped the children back with their fathers without a second thought. And it wasn't just Shirley's children that suffered under her care. It was also her romantic partners who received a heaping helping of cruelty. Shirley systematically abused every single man she ever dated, playing psychological mind games and obsessing over every little detail of how they behaved. She didn't just want a happy relationship, she wanted to have complete control at all times. When one boyfriend attempted to break up with Shirley, she started stalking and harassing him before attempting suicide in his house, dressed in black and holding a bunch of roses. The message behind the suicide attempt was clear. She wanted to teach him a lesson so that he wouldn't go through with the breakup. After being rushed to the hospital, Shirley survived, but the relationship did not. Like so many abusers, Shirley's pattern of violence and control escalated and escalated until it reached a breaking point. The trigger that made Shirley finally snap was her relationship with Andrew Bagby, who was 12 years younger than her. Shirley actually had a habit of dating much younger men. Probably she found them easier to control. The pair kept up a strained, long-distance relationship until Shirley's manipulative, jealous behavior was finally too much to deal with. At one stage, she even robbed his apartment, taking many of Andrew's personal items as well as his laptop. 3 years into her relationship with Andrew, Shirley figured out the perfect way to manipulate him, pretending that she was pregnant with his child. But what she didn't know was that she actually was pregnant with a baby boy who would later be named Zachary. Andrew suspected that Shirley was faking the pregnancy, and when she finally admitted it, Andrew broke up with her. It was around this time, late 2001, that Shirley bought a gun. She started going to shooting lessons, seemingly passionate about handling the weapon correctly. But on the 5th of November, Shirley didn't show up for her shooting lessons or her job. Instead, she drove to Andrew's apartment, where she verbally harassed him until he agreed to meet her at a local park. As promised, Andrew arrived at Keystone State Park to talk to Shirley at around 8 p.m. that evening. The next day, his body was found laying next to his parked car. He had been shot 5 times. Identifying the murder weapon was made easy for investigators because Shirley's gun had a noticeable flaw. It often ejected bullets prematurely. A 6th ejected bullet was found close to Andrew's body, and law enforcement was on the hunt for Shirley Turner. Shirley abandoned her gun and drove to Canada, but she was followed, and by mid-December she was located and arrested. Instead of following the state of Iowa's request to extradite Shirley back to the United States, Justice Gail Welsh decided to keep Shirley in Canada with strict probation conditions and bail set at $75,000 Canadian dollars. It's likely that Shirley's pregnancy was a key factor in this decision, but nobody could have predicted how damning the choice would become. In July of 2002, Shirley gave birth to Zachary. Andrew's parents, David and Kate, were desperately worried about the well-being of their grandchild. They couldn't believe that the woman who had recently shot and killed their son in cold blood was now being allowed to raise his child. The Bagbys were granted shared custody of Zachary, but there were no legal processes in place to stop Shirley from harming him. Shirley quickly began dating another man and continued her pattern of severe psychological abuse, verbal harassment, and stalking. She never told her new boyfriend about the fact that she had murdered her last boyfriend, and when he found out, he broke things off quickly. After the breakup, Shirley called him hundreds of times to threaten him, but he never pressed charges. That breakup sent Shirley into another tailspin. She got her hands on large quantities of an anti-anxiety medication, lorazepam, and overdosed on it. She also mixed a toxic amount of the drug into a bottle of baby formula and fed it to Zachary. Shirley left her car parked on the street outside her most recent boyfriend's house. The front seat was covered with printed out pictures of Zachary and Shirley together, as well as a used tampon. In her erratic, drug-addled state, Shirley seemed to be hoping that she could manipulate her ex one last time by framing him for what was about to happen. Shirley carried Zachary from the Foxtrap Marina and walked to the edge of the fishing wharf. She used the arms of her sweater to tie Zachary to her chest. By now, the high dose of lorazepam had already sedated Zachary, and he was limp and unconscious by the time Shirley threw them both into the Atlantic Ocean. Shirley and Zachary drowned quickly. A couple of tourists found Shirley's body washed up on the beach nearby, and a further search of the area uncovered Zachary's remains as well. So many people had failed Zachary and the rest of Shirley's children. Only one person was ever found guilty of contributing to the 3 deaths, Dr. John Doucette, Shirley's psychiatrist. Dr. Doucette was investigated and found guilty of misconduct, for which he received a $10,000 fine and mandatory psychiatric counseling. This brings us to the film Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. Possibly the most tragic thing about the film is that it wasn't created because of Zachary's death. It was directed by Kurt Kinney, one of Andrew's close friends, in response to his murder. At the time of the filming, Zachary and Shirley were still alive. It was meant to be a tribute to Andrew, a way for those who loved him to remember him by telling the story of his life. The film's intended audience were just a group of close friends, as well as Zachary himself, once he was old enough to understand what had happened. Instead, Dear Zachary inadvertently documented Shirley escalating and her eventual murder-suicide. The purpose changed. Now, Dear Zachary needed to reach a wider audience to raise awareness of abuse, the failure of social services, and the way that the legal systems had failed Zachary and contributed to his murder. Kurt Kinney was dealing with indescribable grief and anger. He became a man on a mission, and that mission was to show Dear Zachary to every single member of the House of Commons of Canada. While Kurt kept raising awareness, he got more and more support. Before long, mass screenings of the film were being held in front of groups of Canada's Parliament. And in 2010, Kurt succeeded in changing Canada's laws to deny bail to any criminal who posed a threat to a child. The bill, named Zachary's Bill, would hopefully prevent other children from meeting the same fate. But it was too late to save the boy it was named after. If Shirley had not been granted bail in Canada, Zachary Bagby would still be alive. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for listening today. And I know in the past on this show, I've talked about doing a whole episode where I do nothing but answer random questions that people send me about various topics and subjects. And the reason I didn't do that is because there's a sizable amount of you listening that don't care about my favorite football team, and that it is and always has been the Buffalo Bills. Believe it or not, some people don't care about me, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't bother me. But I didn't want to, bog down the whole show flow with a whole episode about me. It seems self-serving. So I will periodically grab one or two questions that get emailed to me and answer them here during this part of the show, the part that people can skip if they want to. And this one that I'm going to talk about today, this one is a question from Amy in Texas. Hey, Joe, are you a millennial or a Gen X? And I'm just barely considered a Gen X. I'm right on the edge of it. But I fully grew up like I was just completely Gen X. I had a three-wheeler when I was in the 4th grade. A three-wheeler. That's like a four-wheeler, but with 3 wheels instead of 4. And you know why you don't really see those anymore? Because they were super dangerous and the government banned them. I nearly killed myself in that thing, but my parents bought me one, told me to wear a helmet and go at it. Have fun. I've also gone into gas stations by myself with a note from my mother and a check and bought cigarettes. It sounds unbelievable now, but that was the norm back in like the 80s. But I've jumped off a roof holding an umbrella because someone said, hey, I bet you can float if you do. I've seen, cartoons of Mary Poppins, I guess is where it came from. I did that multiple times. I don't know how I didn't break my ankles, but it doesn't work, in case you're wondering. You just fall just as fast with that umbrella. And that's how Gen X I am. If you have a question or you want to suggest an episode of 10 Minute Murder, you can do that, joe@10minutemurder.com. And if this is your first time listening to 10 Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new ones. Connect with me on social media. See the visuals of what we're talking about here in the podcast. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is very much appreciated. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things 10 Minute Murder. Goodbye.